Hello, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to this year's Online Safety Day. This is our fourth annual Online Safety Day event, but it is the first time that we are here at TikTok's amazing office in London. My name is Andy Robinson. I'm Communications and Marketing Manager at SWGfL, and I'll be with you at certain points throughout the event today. But just first, just a little bit of housekeeping. So the structure of the day, there is going to be three panel discussions. Three panel discussions, one around educating in the 21st century, moving on to one about the Online Safety Act, and then finally one about youth digital wellbeing. There will be a small break in the middle as well, around 10 to 5. With each panel discussion, there'll be 30 minutes, and then there'll be 10 minutes for Q&A. So when we do get to that point, if you do have a question here in the office, please do just raise your hand, and we'll try and get to you. As well, for those of you who are joining us online, please do drop your question into the chat, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. As well, if you're on social media, please do post about the event. We're using the hashtag OSD. So please do that as well, and do follow us where you can across the social channels. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our CEO of SWGfL, David Wright.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to put that just there, because you're probably going to want that, I imagine, so to answer the question of Wi-Fi access. So just to start off, I'm just going to add a few comments. But before I do want to just extend thanks to TikTok for hosting us here today, for organising all of this, and also the streaming that we have as well. So I wanted to really reflect. This time of year often is a time of reflection, and certainly for us, thinking back on what has been a momentous year, another indeed momentous year. It's clearly been dominated, the landscape's been dominated by the royal assent of the Online Safety Bill, now the Online Safety Act. It clearly doesn't need me to tell you that, but it's evidently so from a global perspective too, has had and will continue to have a long-lasting impact. Certainly for us, from the perspective of the Online Safety Act, was a big conversation over the summer around what is impartial dispute resolution or alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. We spent a lot of time really pointing out the fact that the existing Audiovisual Services Directive, the regulations that we did have, included some of this protections for individuals, for those experiencing issues in reporting content, and in fact the Online Safety Act was going to remove those. So that was one of the things that we did spend a lot of time campaigning about, successfully indeed. We saw then when the Online Safety Act, one of the amendments that came through the House of Lords, Clause 217 as part of the Online Safety Act, which actually introduces or gives the Secretary of State powers to implement what is now an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, following on from an Ofcom report that will have to be commissioned and be published within 2 years of royal assent. So I want to really pay tribute to the UK Safe Internet Centre team and the work that went into that over the summer. From a technology perspective, again, other things that have changed, transformed the landscape. Generative AI, again, dominates conversations, dominates aspects too. If we think back just a year ago, where we were, or indeed where we weren't, with regards to the rise of generative AI has been huge. The opportunities it presents, again, it doesn't need me to share that, but in equal measure, the challenges it presents as well. I know certainly 2 weeks ago we published an article where we shared news about some of the reports we were receiving, particularly from schools, about children creating synthetic images of others and sharing those, which got a lot of interest. That followed on from the work that the Internet Watch Foundation did and published back in October to do with their research around looking at generative or AI-created child sex abuse material as well. And pay tribute to the Internet Watch Foundation in doing that and their other extraordinary work as well. Another big part of our year has been around filtering and monitoring. So following from tragedy back in 2018 and the sad loss of one Frankie Thomas, who at age 15 sadly took her own life, and as the coroner concluded in 2021, as a result of content that she viewed, was able to view on a school iPad on a school connection. And so in March, DFE published what are new standards to do with filtering and monitoring, and then made that statutory when it became part of, or embedded in part of, keeping children safe in education. So again, I want to pay tribute to DFE in making that a priority. Over the 20 years I've worked in this space, you know, we've never had that level of focus on that particular subject. The other part of our work over the last year that has consumed quite a lot of time, work and effort is around intimate image abuse. And so many of you will know that we operate, and have done since 2015, the Revenge Porn Helpline. We support adults in the UK who experience non-consensual intimate image abuse. We continue to see a continual escalator in terms of cases. So to give you some articulation about that, in 2019 we managed 1,600 cases. That rose in 2020 to 3,200 cases, 4,400 cases in 21, and then in 22 was just under 11,000 interactions that we had with individuals. And we've reported to over 300,000 images alongside that. It is the first service of its type in the world. It was the first service of its type in the world. This year, we've seen a further 23% increase in cases of adults experiencing this. We had Sky News visit and publish a documentary online 2 weeks ago about the work of the Revenge Porn Helpline. Indeed, Izzy's with us today, who's from and works on the RP helpline and doing extraordinary work. And again, I pay tribute to the dedication of that team as well. There is clearly still much work to be done there. We have a 90% takedown rate of content when we do report content, NCI images. Therefore, 10% of the content we report still remains online. So it's about 30,000 URLs, many of which, in actual fact, are connected to successful prosecutions. So despite having successful prosecutions, that content still remains online. In fact, the law actually prevents us from actually taking access to block access to that known non-consensual intimate image abuse that exists online, which is rather bizarre and rather mad. So we continue to very much work and highlight that issue as well. Connected to that, Stop NCII, you may well have seen on the clip earlier on, stopncii.org, which is the platform we launched back in December 2021, the world's first device-side hashing technology that stands for any victim, any adult, anywhere in the world who's experiencing non-consensual intimate image abuse or having their images being threatened to be posted online. So as a victim, you merely visit the website, stopncii.org, and you create what is a hash, a digital fingerprint, a unique identifier for your image or your video. You never share your image or video. It always remains within your control on your device. But it's this hash code, this digital fingerprint that gets added onto the data bank and then distributed instantaneously onto partner platforms, of which when we launched, and a year ago, 2 years ago, when we launched, was with Facebook and with Instagram. A year ago, on its first anniversary, we then added TikTok, again, tribute to TikTok, and Bumble. Then, you know, as a part of the course of this particular year, seen some extraordinary focus around this. So in March, we were at the United Nations Convention on the Status of Women conference, alongside the Foreign Office, the Australian government, the Kenyan government, where we were very proud as well to announce both Reddit and OnlyFans, who also joined as participating platforms, so taking these hashes to instantaneously prevent anyone else uploading that content on behalf of these particular victims. Over the period too, we've added Threads and ALO, and then 3 weeks ago at an event at the White House, we also added Snap. So it's this increasing number of partners and platforms that are taking these hashes. On its second anniversary 2 weeks ago, we went from 40,000 hashes a year ago to over 420,000 hashes, so over 180,000 individuals that stopnci.org across the world continues to support. And again, I want to pay more tribute here to particularly to the Foreign Office and also to the White House for Rachel Grant and also Kaylin Crockett too, in the work that they're doing in this case as well. There is though much more work to do. There are a couple of things that we are taking the opportunity of releasing today. And so we're going to talk a bit more about those during one of the panel sessions. But one is around accrediting, filtering and monitoring, or particularly accrediting filtering providers for schools across England, but indeed broader in terms of the UK, as well as new guidance that the Professionals Online Safety Helpline is also launching that's helping support particularly staff who are experiencing harmful sexual behaviour as a member of staff as well. So the things that they can do to help protect themselves, indeed. And so we'll talk perhaps a bit about that on the panel too. So that's my kind of introduction. It has, as you can kind of tell, been another really momentous day. But often too, onto the reasons that you've kind of been here, or you've come here today, you've joined us as well online, is around some of the panel discussion. So Boris, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And hello, everybody. My name is Boris. I'm head of engagement and today's first and last panel leader. And really nice to see you. Oh, there's so many of you. And hello, everybody online as well. There's hundreds of people there. Please ask us questions in the chat. We will be asking that to our panelists. So let's invite them first. May I invite David Wright, CEO of SWGfL, Laurie Matthews, TikTok teacher creator. That's going to be an interesting conversation. And Margaret Mulholland from ASCL, Inclusion Policy Specialist for the Association of Schools and College Leaders. Thank you so much for joining us and finding the time to these beautiful TikTok offices, which we once more say thank you so much for hosting us. And we'll be discussing education in the 21st century, which is a lot of words and a lot of difficulty for something that hasn't changed basically over hundreds of years, but it is now in a way, I wouldn't say threatened, by maybe provided opportunity with technology that we can do something more, something different. So we're going to have a 30-minute structured discussion session with our panelists, and after that we have a 10-minute Q&A, and my dear team will warn me when that time comes because we will definitely overrun. So my first question goes to Laurie. So technology has immensely changed in the last 30, 35 years since the invention of the internet, but combining that with your experiences and as well the teaching profession in general, how has technology changed the teaching profession and how it is being used in the classroom by teachers and by students? Can it be used better?
It's on, yes. So I'll just contextualize this by saying that I have not been a teacher for a huge amount of time. I'm in my 6th year of teaching. I've worked across 2 schools, and I'm currently a head of history in a girls' grammar school. So I don't probably have the huge breadth of experience that many of the people here and viewing do. But even in that short time, I've seen technology change massively in the classroom, predominantly catalyzed, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic, which just made technology so much more essential to all of our experiences in the classroom. But even looking back in my experience in education as a student and thinking about how we use technology, some teachers had PowerPoints, but that wasn't the standard, whereas I would say that it's normal for most students to have a PowerPoint in every lesson, and the digital access to those resources through either a Google Drive or OneDrive or something similar, which means that students have better access if they're absent and can catch up and can revise more easily. You have retrievals which are based in technology through Kahoots and through Microsoft Forms quizzes. You have assessments based in technology now, and also more of an emphasis of the use of technology in terms of GCSE and A-level choices with computer sciences and things like that too. So in a very, very short amount of time, particularly through the pandemic, as I say, the use of technology in the classroom has just been astronomical.
Thank you. The benefits and the challenges at the same time. We need to bring a lot of people and educate them at the same time how to use the technology, but as well how to stay safe on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think back to the induction days that we were doing last year in my school, and we actually had a session on Andrew Tate as staff to learn about these influences that our students are having online that we as teachers might not necessarily have, because even if we are online, we might not have the same algorithm as our students and therefore might not be aware of so many of the influences that our students do have. And so specific CPD sessions on TikTok, on Instagram, on Snapchat, on all manner of technology, even down to kind of dating apps sometimes, particularly with regard to our older students and their access to pornography and sexual images online, has all become a much more prevalent part of and prominent part of our CPD and training outside of the classroom, so that we can keep our students safe inside and in their personal lives as well.
Thank you, Lauren. And I think it's beautifully brings us to the next question, if I come to you, Margaret, for that. New technology brings new opportunity and of course, new challenges. So what do you think those challenges is, especially from this perspective of inclusion policy specialist for the Association for Schools and College Leaders? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's so many positives, as Laurie says. We really want to look at those, we want to champion those, but I think from a school leader perspective, and the Association of School and College Leaders sort of represents 25,000 school leaders, we have a real sort of concern about putting those ambitions in context. And I think there are multiple challenges for school leaders at the moment, as we all know. You know, predominantly things like pupil well-being, mental health, attendance, behaviour, relationships, complexity of needs that we're seeing in young people, and also the wider relationships with parents that have shifted post-pandemic. How do we make sure that the safeguarding needs that we have concerns about for young people are really placed in that context? And I think that's why we need such support from partner organisations like Southwest Grid for Learning to really think about, you know, what are the best choices to keep schools safe, to keep young people safe. So I think we need to put it in context of that today through all the conversations. I want to unpack a little bit for those who are not teachers, what we mean by the context and those worries. In terms of, and I'm sure you've heard this statistic before, pre-pandemic, we had 1 in 9 young people who had a mental health diagnosis. Post-pandemic, we saw that as 1 in 6. We now have these very worrying updates around, for example, 44% of Year 13 students experiencing psychological distress. So real high levels of anxiety, uncertainty, lack of safety. We have the Good Childhood report recently that said 1/3 of 10 to 17-year-olds were unhappy. Now, that's really important when we think about what our purpose is in becoming a technical profession and establishing tech across school communities. Interestingly, and in terms of what we've heard about in terms of online bullying and sexual harassment, girls' happiness is significantly lower than that of young men. How do we ensure we're supporting both to rectify those things, and how do we use tech in that context to really support? I think there are 3 things that just very briefly I wanted to mention in terms of the dilemmas that school leaders have. And I think the dilemma is, on the one hand, you know, building technology for schools, so increasing availability and accessibility, thinking about digital poverty, thinking about access to technology for all, and inclusion, digital inclusion, and how we build that at the same time as marrying that against those real concerns around knowledge. How do we share knowledge so that our staff are upskilled, that they do understand what access young people are having and why the behaviours we're now seeing in schools have shifted and changed. So knowledge of staff, knowledge of parents, knowledge of young people is really important. And also, I think, then, safety as a priority and being the most important, perhaps, priority of all. But that tension of growth alongside keeping children and young people safe. And I think, there's so much good. We looked recently at I think it's been widely shared, the sort of Leo Academy's impact report on the really valuable efficiencies that can be made in using technology in our schools. And how do we marry that with not being risk averse as school leaders who have to protect young people? I think one of the things that's been useful in terms of EdTech reports is that kind of clarity about the lack of confidence that's a real challenge and barrier for school leaders. So the EdTech report showed that 88% of school leaders and 58% of teachers cited skills and confidence as a barrier to the uptake of EdTech. So I think those things are really important, that accessibility and that knowledge. But then finally, really thinking just quickly about safety. And I think really, we've seen such a shift in the experiences of schools. Safety is the most important thing, but possibly the most challenging thing. The decisions school leaders make are high risk in terms of purchasing power, in terms of tech. How do we ensure that we're making the right decisions? We've seen the experience of the post office scandal and how in purchasing systems to support efficiencies, we can sometimes get it wrong, and tech can get it wrong. So we need trusted allies in terms of quality assurance, in terms of prevention. 1 in 10 primary schools have experienced cyber attacks in the last 12 months. So there's a huge implication there. And then I think just finally, the biggest issue perhaps, and one that you're really going to champion today, that notion that social media can, really support young people's well-being, but it can also damage young people's well-being. And social media has proved to be a very effective medium for bullying. And I think that's something we need to not just react to, we need to be proactive in challenging and recognizing.
Wonderful, thank you. Like this last segment, we need more action definitely on the issues that we understand, which are the challenges, and we heard about the opportunities or maybe some future opportunities, and thank you so much for bringing a light to the challenges. But for my next question, I'll come then to David. After 23 years of doing that and listening to the opportunities and the challenges, what is there that is available now for teachers that they can find support and guidance? What are the resources for those challenges provided for them?
Thank you, Boris. So 23 years. We were 23 years old actually a couple of weeks ago as a charity. So there is a depth of experience there. One of the things that we do, I think, as a community and from an education perspective, we do benefit from an awful lot of resources and availability out there. But I think has been described, this ever increasingly complex world is difficult, particularly difficult for schools, many schools, to perhaps to understand and to comprehend. Which I think Margaret mentioned it there around some of these standards. That was one of the things that today we want to take the opportunity to announce that. So from January next year, we're intending to release an accreditation mechanism for filtering providers. Based on the experience, the instances that I kind of mentioned earlier on, and the ever-increasing world that technology, the complex world that technology represents in the classroom, the ability which this case alone just epitomizes why it's very difficult, increasingly difficult to manage that complex situation. I asked myself, from the Frankie Thomas's school perspective, yes, there was a catalogue of failures as the coroner concluded, but what can we realistically expect? Should a school be realistically expected to be able to manage that complex world? And so I think it is, as Margaret said, through floor standards, through accreditation, some basic levels and some trust that can be put back into the system. So from next month, we are intending to release, as the UK Safe Internet Centre, this accreditation for filtering providers. In terms of resources that people can access, we are clearly at TikTok. One of the things is the Professionals Online Safety Helpline that we operate. We've operated that since 2011. And so supporting particularly schools, but indeed anyone working with children across the UK with any form of online safety-related issue, that over the last 2 years has been dominated with reporting cases where children, particularly children, have created explicit and obscene accounts, often on TikTok. And so we have this operational relationship with TikTok that we can then directly escalate those cases on behalf of schools. Schools don't actually have to report them to the platform. We can do that on their behalf. And to the end of November this year, we reported just under 7,000 accounts, with the vast majority of those being efficiently removed. Not all, but the vast majority. Resources too. Project Evolve, again we saw it on the clip, projectevolve.co.uk. This is our digital competency framework that's entirely free to go and to use, but takes a different approach to online safety. It's rather than telling children what they shouldn't be doing, it builds skills and layers year by year, and then enables particularly teachers to understand what skills, what strengths their children have already got. It's pointless telling them what they already know. We want to focus on where their gaps are, which is exactly what the assessment mechanism within Project Evolve does. It's used by some 60,000 teachers since it launched 2 years ago, and there's been 2.4 million assessments and continues to at that rate. And I can't not mention Safer Internet Day. In terms of resources, Safer Internet Day, the 6th of February, 2024. Hopefully that's a note that everyone's made. The 6th of February, 2024 is clearly our annual day, despite every day being Safer Internet Day. 6th of February is when the limelight is always cast and enabling the broader world, but particularly those activities that the UK Safer Internet Centre will engage with on that day. So if I haven't mentioned it already, Safer Internet Day is on the 6th of February next year.
And can I just say something about the helpline, and just to say our thanks, really, as school leaders. We went through a horrendous time, I think it's fair to say, last year when this started, and these online bullying, really, of staff in many ways. And young people were unclear about what they were doing, why they were doing it. It's continued, but the systems and processes that we've been able to rely on with the helpline have made that situation much more manageable, and it's developed the learning and the understanding, I think, of the school communities. So huge thank you to you for the work you've done on that. It's been really effective. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I can come to you for the next question, David did speak about some of the resources available. Let's be honest, what do you think about the resources that are available? Are they right? Are they effective enough? Are they fit for the future? I know it's a big question, but what would be your opinion?
Well, I think we've seen as an example of that, the sort of reactive resources are effective, but technology is changing constantly, and I think what we really need to do is look at what we can do together proactively, and the Evolve project sounds really effective from that perspective. I think what we hear a lot in schools, and some of the school leaders here will be giving a wry smile to this, is that we need a whole school approach. And we hear that about everything. Yeah, of course, it's true. We need every teacher. We don't just need the head of year 10 or the ICT coordinator or the head teacher to be aware. We need everybody. But for the designated safeguarding lead, I think the new expectations to keep children safe and to have oversight of that are huge and overwhelming and possibly not sustainable. So collaboration is important, but equally proactivity in terms of the curriculum. I think we can't just teach children to remain safe and be vigilant. We actually have to equip them with digital skills and criticality that will enable them to really navigate and have agency when using online platforms. And I think that has to be a huge driver in influencing curriculum change as we go forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And for the next question, I'll go to Laurie. We heard about the resources, we heard about opportunities and threats, but the technology is not going to stop. It's only getting faster and getting more complex and more unknown to many of us. in recent times, or in the last couple of years, to the media attention, an explosion of AI tools like ChatGPT, OpenAI, many others. How do we think this is going to impact and things in general? But should we be teaching teens how to use it? Should we be forbidding it in schools? What is your opinion about using that?
Do you know, I think if you went into our staff room at work, the concept of AI is probably one of the most divisive in current topics at the moment. You have the teachers who are really excited by the opportunities, and then you also have the staff members who are quite kind of nervous by the drawbacks and the negatives of it, and there's a real kind of divide in terms of what side people sit on. Personally, I'm very excited by lots of elements of AI, particularly from a teaching perspective. I think there are several things which will ultimately reduce our workload, and if we can do that, then that's only a positive from my perspective, and there's a lot of things which we can use it for, certainly to make our lives easier. When it comes to the students and their use of AI, one of the big things that we talk about in our history department for our A-levels is our coursework element, because of course that's such an extended piece of writing and research, and the skills associated with it are the purpose of the coursework. But it would be very easy for a student to go to ChatGPT and to ask it a question, and for it to write a 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, whatever thousand word answer, which they could, even if they didn't just submit it, which you would hope would be obvious to spot, but may not be, they could certainly use as a basis, as a head start, to get them ahead. And that's what we're predominantly concerned about. And how do we stop that? Because as I understand it at the moment, I won't pretend to be an AI expert, but as I understand it, it's quite difficult to track AI plagiarism and AI tracking in a student's piece of work. And I can't guarantee that if I were to receive the 4,500 word coursework from my students, but I would be able to recognize what was AI and what was student generated, particularly if they were smart enough to read through and edit it before submitting it to me. So there's certainly a concern around that. When it comes to homework and other work with AI, I certainly think that the answer is yes, we should be teaching this. I don't think it's an option to forbid it into schools and to say, no, you can't use it, because ultimately that's a tool that exists, and they go home and they don't have the firewalls and the filtering that we have in school. So even if we block it there, they will find a way around it. So I think we have no option but to embrace it and to teach the students how to use it responsibly. Because just as it can reduce my workload, I see no reason why, used correctly, the students shouldn't also use it to their advantage, because it's a tool that is, I think we can say, here to stay, here to develop, and a tool which students can use with their digital skills to their advantage as well. And when I think about the work that I set my students, I often ask myself, well, am I setting it for the knowledge, or am I setting it for the skills? Because if I'm setting it for the skills, then I need them to do it themselves. But if I'm setting it for the knowledge, and the AI can give them 9 reasons why the Treaty of Versailles was a complete failure, and then they can go from there, well, then why shouldn't they use that as a jumping off point? So it's something that isn't kind of catered for at the moment, and something which I'm really hoping more legislation will come in place, more tools, more kind of sites, and more collaborative thinking, particularly with social medias, with companies like yourselves, that we can work with. But I think it's really important that teachers, safeguarding leads, all members of school do kind of have an awareness of the opportunities and the drawbacks of AIs, because students are certainly going to.
We all definitely share the responsibility. And thank you so much for that. And I know we spoke a little bit earlier. I want to pose you another question. We know that unfortunately for every one educational piece of content or website online, there's 10 adult websites. And what would be your advice for any teacher that is considering using their knowledge, their expertise of engaging on TikTok or any other social media to share some of that knowledge and maybe reach a wider audience from your perspective and from your experience?
So I've obviously been very fortunate with my school to be a practitioner who is also very active on social media. I know that a lot of my students follow me and they interact with me on social media. I know that because they're not subtle with their usernames. It's usually their first name followed by a dot and then their last name. And I think, oh, that's very safe. So I know that they follow me and I have no power to stop them unless I block them. But then I also think, well, if I do that, they can just create another username, which is not quite as on the nose, and then they'll follow me anyway. When I applied for my current school, I already had a reasonable social media following. So before I even put an application in, I said to the then head teacher at the time, look, I have a reasonable following on social media. I don't really have any intention of stopping that. Would that be a problem in applying to work at your school? And I'm very fortunate that my head teacher is extremely forward-thinking when it comes to technology. He's obviously given me permission to have the day off to come here today. I work down in Devon, so it wouldn't have been possible without that. So yeah, shout out Mr. Sargent. He's also kind of utilised my skills as well, because he's created a sixth form TikTok account, which I now also head up with assistance from our sixth formers as a form of school marketing. So he's gone, yes, you can do that, and you can do something for me as well at the same time. So fair enough. Something that I think probably did ring alarm bells was with the safeguarding lead, when they heard that there was going to be a head of history who was active on social media, and that wasn't something at the time that our school guidelines accounted for. In fact, they said the policy was that there's to be no connection between staff and students on social media, which I think is probably a universal policy. And I remember she came and spoke to me on my first training day, first day at a new school, so I was nervous enough already, and she said, I do need to talk to you about your social media accounts. And I thought, here we go, she's going to tell me that I can't have them, I have to get rid of them. I was all prepared to go, well, do you know what? I'm a woman on social media, and I'm going out and I'm doing things, and I think it's really important that we emulate to our students, but this is the sort of thing that they can do, and to use social media responsibly. And all she said was, I just need to have a chat with the governors to get some wording changed in our policy, so that it no longer says no interaction on social media, but no mutual connections on social media. So my advice for teachers, practitioners, is to be open with schools about that. And I understand that that's easier said than done, and there will be many schools who are nervous about teachers on social media, because historically it's been a bit of a taboo subject. We're supposed to kind of not exist in the real world outside of our classrooms. And, you know, I think as practitioners, we've all seen that shocked look on a student's face when they see us in a supermarket and they go, you're not in your classroom. And you go, no, I do food shop sometimes. But of course we exist on social media, and with the new generation of teachers coming through, more and more we exist on social media. So I think it's unrealistic, and it kind of puts teachers on that pedestal that we're often put on as kind of these figures of educational prowess that don't exist in the normal world. And hardly any other professions have that expectation of their participants. So I hope that schools will embrace it, because how can we teach our students to use social media responsibly if we ourselves don't demonstrate that we are capable of using social media responsibly? So as open as possible, and hopefully the schools will go with it with support from organisations like the ones gathered here today.
Thank you. No, Laurie, a beautiful story, and thank you so much for sharing with us. We're going to cut to a Q&A in 5 minutes, so let's start thinking about your questions. There are going to be mics going around. But for my last question, if I can come to you, David, we heard about how we can utilize the technology in the future, and as well how we can reach new audiences which are growing up. But what would be the best practices that we know that when it comes to digital education, digital safety education? And I think the last one, which is $1 million, how to keep up with the technology that's developing so fast?
So just before I think I answer that question, Boris, and we're always renowned for asking questions that aren't on the script. So, Laurie, something that you said, I think, you know, we've long talked about this too, but in previous kind of new technologies like social media when it came out. So it's something that Douglas Adams said, and it kind of applies universally, I think. What he said, so anything that happens when you're born is entirely natural. Any change that happens between when you're age 2 and age 10 is exciting, is super exciting. Any change that happens between when you're 10 and you're 30, you make a career out of. And any change that happens after you're 30 is a threat to the human race, which I think, you know, I suspect the staff room is divided across that kind of that watershed of probably age, which, you know, long as it's been said, you know, grappling with new technologies is always a real challenge, particularly for those of us that fall into the latter kind of category in terms of ages. But it is, as you say, really important.
I resent that, Dave.
So just in terms of, I think, best practice and ahead of the QA, I'm just going to signpost a few things, really. I've mentioned, you know, again, this is probably more from a school perspective, school organisation perspective. So, you know, things like Project Evolve, there's a wealth of resources that are out there in terms of classroom and availability, and indeed free to go and access. In terms of school organisation, 360safe.org.uk, we first launched this back in 2009 and used by some 16,500 schools across the country as a self-assessment mechanism to enable you to challenge yourself as a school, to understand where you're at and indeed where you're going and how you compare to the rest of the nation. Understanding if filtering's working. Now, of Standard 2, now I'm specifically talking here around the DFE standard, so applies to schools and colleges in England. The Standard 2 that's got introduced with the expectation to be able that schools have to both have reviewed their filtering and monitoring systems or provision and also checked that they're working and will have done that within the last 12 months. Now, it was posed the question a few years ago, how do you check that filtering's working, save for going for searching for stuff that you know should be filtered, which we would never clearly advocate. And so testfiltering.com, a little utility that enables you just to go and run a test completely safely in the background, but just pings a few pages to see quietly from your visual perspective if filtering's working on your connection. And we're currently working on a kind of an automated mechanism that will then automate that process that will certainly help that. Finally, I just want to mention too something that we launched on Monday with DFE, again, schools in England around cyber secure, so a self-assessment mechanism that schools across England, in fact anyone who's free to go and use, can understand and go self-assess around their cyber security mechanism. So a variety of things there, Boris, that we can add into the equation and signpost.
Thank you very much. Yes, Margaret.
Can I just add a couple of challenges there in the sense that, I mean, these are so valuable for school leaders as tools and essential, actually. But just highlight the issues around, the rapidity of change and the fact that time and funding are really big challenges for schools. And I think, DFE are on an away day, I believe, today. But if they're listening to the playback on this, it is those things that sometimes feel rather intangible, but time and capacity building, time for CPD, real training for a whole school approach. We need the opportunity to work collaboratively, to talk, to reflect, and those are real pulls on the priorities for schools at the moment. So I'd really advocate for that in relation to, we want to use these tools, we want to use them well, we want all staff to understand them and how to utilise them and what are the best ways of keeping young people safe, and advocating for real digital pedagogy, but we need some time to do that effectively.
Wonderfully said. Thank you so much. And thank you to our speakers. We're now opening for questions. And if you can put your hands up if you're in the room, a mic should find a way to you. In the online part, there's some questions there. In the online part, there's questions from there as well. So the panel was educating in the 21st century. This panel can go on for days and hours. So let me jump to Andy first, maybe for the first question.
So we've had a few people really pleased to hear about whole school approach.
Whole school approach, okay. How do we define a whole school approach? That is a really good question. I'm not sure if it's for our speakers at the panel. Would somebody want to try to tackle that?
Yeah, so I think I raised it, didn't I? So I think I said it, and I said you might trigger a wry smile in the sense that exactly that, what does it mean? And we have to do that in relation to all sorts of themes. Behaviour is a whole school approach. Attendance, we're having a whole school approach. Mental health and well-being, it's a whole school approach. So I think the real question is, how do we make sure that digital learning and safety is permeated throughout schools' shared responsibilities, roles and responsibilities, but it's not just divvying up roles and responsibilities for safeguarding and digital inclusion. It's also about knowledge distribution. We can't have a whole school approach if we don't have the knowledge required. So again, I go back to my asks for more training and development time, but also the QA'd trainers and platforms with online training that might be accessible so that schools can use those really effectively.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think we have questions in the room. Do you have mics with you? No? Oh, there's mics in the back. Yeah, if we can go for the first. Yes, there. and just kind of circle the mic. We have 5 to 7 minutes for questions, so let's get as much as we can. Hello and welcome.
Hi. Thanks very much. I just wanted to build on what Margaret said about time. So I was a primary school leader and now I work in initial teacher education, and I'm very grateful for the Project Evolve resources. They're fantastic, and I've loved signposting new teachers towards them. But I want to build on your problem of time, because there's so much in there. And you've already said the idea of the whole school approach and the packed national curriculum, and every Ofsted review that comes out that says more time on music, more time on history, more time on art, more time on DT. And then we're looking at the problems with well-being and mental health, and somehow this still isn't the priority. And so how do we put pressure on the government, on the DofE, to make sure that this is actually given time, so that we can take care of the children first in such a knowledge-rich environment?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Where do we go to buy time, and how do we put pressure on the government to make sure that we have the time and that our professionals do have the time? It's a big question. David, would you like a...
Where do we magic time from, I guess, is probably it's a bit beyond this panel about magicking time. I think so, certainly from our perspective, creating things and creating utilities, services, resources is all around making it as simple as we possibly can, to make it as obvious and as accessible as we possibly can, because we're always really acutely aware that everybody is really strapped for time, I think. One of the things that Laurie mentioned, which we're optimistic about, I guess, is, you know, some of the new technologies, particularly generative AI, the positives, the opportunities around some of that may well hopefully help in terms of teacher workload or planning, helping with planning at least as well. So it's not really a direct answer, short of it's one of the things that is uppermost in our minds. Hence, hopefully you'll see that in some of the output is there to make it as simple and as easy as we possibly can.
I suppose one of the other aspects as well is to advocate for building into the professional development frameworks, the MPQs, the ECF, early career framework for teachers, and the initial teacher training framework. So actually that we're much more explicit about what's needed. And I think the point you've made about the curriculum and the curriculum being too stretched, I think, you know, there's a clear emphasis now, I think, on the need for change, and to determine what our goals are, what are our priorities for young people. Is it to be safe and happy, or is it to be able to remember information? And I think we need a better balance around that.
I'll just add, one of the things that with Project Evolve, we've tried to map different parts of the curriculum. So not just kind of, it's not Tuesday afternoon, therefore it's online safety. It's making resources, you know, from a European network, InSafe network perspective, we're UK Safer Internet Centre is one of 32 European Safer Internet Centres. You know, the output we had a number of years ago, we had resources that were created by the French Safer Internet Centre, which we started approaching and thinking, well, we could just translate that. And then we think, well, hang on, no, it would be great because we could just put that as an MFL particular resource that could be used in a different part of the curriculum, but it gets across some of those safeguarding messages, again, hopefully to save time, but to distribute it and percolate it, as Margaret said, across different parts of the curriculum.
Thank you. Thank you as well. We might have time for one, maybe two questions. Yes, please. Whoever has the mic. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi. Does the panel believe that a ban on anonymity would assist, particularly picking up on what Laurie was saying about people will just pop up with another handle, etc., assist to protect children online, especially from bullying, etc., and also that together with authentication of age and identity as a combination, so people can stand up and be counted when they are actually bullying, and also together with the sexual content.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. It's a two-part question, rather complex one. One is, would ban on identity help, or kind of anonymity online, would that help, or ban on that will help with abuse? What do you think? Anybody want to tackle that? Yes, please.
I can certainly speak on from my experience as a classroom practitioner and a tutor as well, that the vast majority of online bullying issues that I've dealt with as a tutor have been anonymous, and therefore from a school's perspective incredibly difficult to deal with, because if we do not know who the perpetrator is, then we kind of have to look at this kid and say, well, there's not a lot we can do, which is heartbreaking and loses trust from the children's perspective in us as people to turn to for help. Additionally, from a creator perspective, I've worked with brands previously, and since I am a teacher, I'm quite careful about the kind of content I create and the kind of brands that I work with. And occasionally I get a gambling brand or an alcohol brand want to do a collaboration with me, which is lovely. I always say to them, well, you know, I'm a teacher, I have to be quite careful about these sorts of things. I'm not sure it's appropriate. And I've had brands come back to me and say, well, we've actually had a look at your followers and you don't have any followers under the age of 18. Yes, I definitely do. So it's definitely there, that lack of verification. And I firmly believe that proper verification of age would not only mean more appropriate content consumption for underage people, but also a safer internet environment. And it would be great if they could stop being anonymous. It would help me massively.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, so ban anonymity, age verification.
Okay, I was just going to, it was an interesting point, Laurie. So one of the things that we did a number of years ago is actually realising about anonymity and trying to use it positively. So on the premise that if a child, particularly in a school, is experiencing an issue or witnessing an issue, if we have anonymous-based reporting mechanisms, that might make them more likely to go and report something to you. So trying to use anonymity positively to give them this kind of, as we refer to it, running away bravely. So this SWGfL Whisper anonymous reporting mechanism. The question about age verification, there's clearly a codes of practice that Ofcom just published for consultation. Now, I think more generally speaking, for age verification, age checking, age gating, call it what you will, certainly we're great advocates of age gating and age verification, particularly for younger children. So given all the data and the information around the availability of pornography, the age of first exposure to pornography, and it's usually associated with shock, or it was unintentional access. We're firm believers that age verification will introduce mechanisms that will make that less likely to happen, but realise, like all of us, realise that it's not going to prevent children with particular intent to access that sort of content.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, as well. This was the first panel. There are many questions left. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to stick with the agenda. I'm the one you have to hate. But these people will be here during the break, and they will be here during the entire event. So catch them and ask them the questions, or ask those questions to our team, and we'll get back to you. So this was the panel discussion about educating in the 21st century. We had David Wright, CEO of SWGfL, Margaret Mulholland, Inclusion Policy Specialist for the Association of School and College Leaders, and Laurie Matthews, history teacher and TikTok creator. Can we have a big round of applause for our panelists? They were lovely. They were awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you to our dear panelists. And we go to our second panel session, which is chaired by TikTok and has wonderful speakers as well. I think Ben is here. I'm passing the mic to Ben. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Boris. Can I invite the speakers up to the stage, please? That's Rich, Sarah. Yeah, great. How's it going? Thank you. Great. And just in terms of housekeeping, there is a break after this as well, so it's not far to go until you get your teas and coffees. So we're here to talk about the Online Safety Act. And I think we've all been lucky, fortunate, unfortunate enough to have followed this for many, many years, I think, collectively, since it kind of first began. So today we're joined by Sarah Blight, who is Online Safety Principal at Ofcom, by Hugh Turner, who's the Head of Online Harms Implementation at the Department of Science and Technology, and Richard Collard, who's the Child Safety Online Protection Lead at the NSPCC. And I think you've all kind of worked in this space for a very long time as the Act has moved through. And I think a good starting point, I think there's a lot of people in the audience with lots of different experience on this. Some will have worked as closely as you have on this over previous years, and whereas others may be kind of new to the issues at hand. So I guess it would be great to start, Hugh, just kind of, if you could explain the thinking behind the Online Safety Act, the kind of journey that it's been through, kind of what you hope that it achieves once it's kind of fully enforced, just to provide a bit of scene setting for everyone here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Right level of sound there. Yeah, cool. So it's been quite a journey for the Act, and it does quite a lot of things. So I might try and pare it back a little bit to some of the core intent behind the legislation. And I think that is sort of the mutual recognition of three different things. The first is that the internet is increasingly, or maybe just is now, a massive part of day-to-day life for us, for our kids, for most people. It's embedded as part of most of the things you do day to day. Secondly, that with that comes a lot of massive benefits. I mean, we were hearing about the previous panel talking about what it means for kids in schools, if done right. I think we all use it day to day to talk to people, to find content, build relationships, derive information, look at the news. But alongside that is the third recognition that certain places and certain services on the internet, if not managed appropriately, come with an outsized risk, and that is the risk that criminality or harmful information and content can spread at unprecedented scale and speed and can reach the kind of audiences, particularly children and other young people, that it might not have historically reached. So the thinking behind the bill is to put a framework in place, which Ofcom will enforce as the new regulator, to ensure that those particular spaces and services are run and managed responsibly. And I think you just asked about timelines. I think there's a lot to get done. The headline is that we've put a statutory deadline on the regulator to have the core parts of that regime, which focus on criminality, pornography, and children's rights and children's protection, in place within 18 months of royal assent. So that's within 18 months from October.
Yeah. And Rich, you've obviously, as the NSPCC, have been kind of campaigning on this issue for a long time. Is there anything you can share from that experience of kind of the genesis from idea through to act that you'd want to share?
Sure. So at the NSPCC, we have been arguing for some form of regulation or legislation for about 6-7 years now. I think we originally won the commitment back in 2017 when Matt Hancock was DSIT Secretary of State, so a very long time ago now. And what we had recognised at the NSPCC was there was a significant backdrop of harm that was occurring. We had seen a spike in online grooming offences. We were seeing a spike in child sexual abuse image offences. And if you've looked at the last 6 years, that's increased only by 84%. We've seen a coroner conclude that a technology platform or two technology platforms, Instagram and Pinterest, were directly, their actions directly contributed to the death of a child. So this backdrop really meant that we felt there was a need for significant legislation to come into effect. And what we see the bill, or the Act now, as doing is providing another pillar of the child protection framework. So making sure that technology companies, where often this abuse is taking place, or can be a platform where it's it can either exacerbate or reduce harm, that they have a incentive to tackle that harm.
Thanks. And Sarah, obviously, a lot of people in this room will be working directly with children, either in a safeguarding capacity, just in a general teaching capacity, or have worked on this for some time. What do you think the biggest changes that they can expect from the Act to be, kind of as you get to grips with regulating, basically?
Yeah, I think from a frontline perspective, it's about children and young people's experiences online, and the education point, as you've already been covering today, is really important, and having that awareness and making sure that online safety is not a one-off thing that's taught on particular days of the year, but is absolutely baked into everything that we do in terms of children's lives, because they see it as one continuum, obviously, not as separate parts of their life. In terms of Ofcom, it's not a content-based regime, so just to make that really clear. And sometimes that is quite misunderstood by, obviously, the various stakeholders. the onus is on the services themselves to have the systems and processes in place to make sure that they can comply with their safety duties in the Act. How does that translate to the experience of a child or young person over the next few months and years? Our intent absolutely is, as Rich said, is this is one pillar in a wider child protection sort of strategy that we need to make children's lives safer online. We are really hoping that not just the hard powers and the hard levers that we'll have as they come into force, and actually it's probably quite key to say that our powers come into force in a very staged way to make sure that we have enough time, which is absolutely right, to consult with all our stakeholders, including children and young people, and their thoughts about our codes of practice. But as they come in, we're really, our intent is actually holistically through engagement with industry, through shining a light, encouraging more transparency, encouraging more conversations about innovation and safety tech solutions, that actually we start to raise standards across industry. And that for us is a massive, massive win in terms of children's online safety. Of course, we have hard levers in terms of fines, and there's a criminal liability as well. But, for us to be able to galvanise online services to actually really consider their systems and processes, what are they doing to keep children safe online, making sure that children's experiences are a lot safer, they know how to report, there are safety settings, etc. There are very clear terms of service, very clear governance and child safety responsibilities and child safety policies. These are all really key for us to lay those foundations going forward. And then for particular harms, and the illegal harms consultation out at the moment covers a range of harms, not just child sexual abuse, to really have some tough measures in place that if there is risk of those harms on their services, that there are a number of mitigations that we have developed and recommended and are out for consultation at the moment, that those services must deploy to make sure children are safe from things like online grooming, that we are absolutely doing something about the huge proliferation of child sexual abuse material and other parts of child sexual abuse. And our intent is to lay that foundation and build on those codes of practice over the next few years.
Yeah, and I think those consultation periods are going to be really important because there is a lot of good practice out there, and I think it's important that kind of people have a chance to represent those to you, so that can be adopted kind of more widely across industry. Because you're not just looking for gold stars, you're also looking to raise the barrier, right? So I think it's 100,000 companies that will be captured by the regulation, right? So make sure they can all learn from what other companies are doing. And you mentioned kind of continuous experience of childhood before, and that's something that we think about really closely in the way that we design TikTok. So when you're 13 to 15, many features are kind of turned off by default. When you're 16 to 17, some of those you can opt into if you want to, and then obviously when you're 18, you're an adult and you can kind of have access to the app in the kind of most open way. But kind of, Rich, you kind of mentioned it before around the kind of campaign running up to the Act. We have an Act now. Kind of, what are your priorities kind of going forward over the next few months kind of and years, I guess? Kind of how do you kind of seek to make sure that the youth voice is represented kind of going forward, and not just kind of in the design of the bill, but the kind of ongoing running of it?
Sure. So I suppose if you think of the NSPCC, we're fundamentally a child rights charity. We're child protection and child rights, and that's something that fundamentally runs through the organisation. And in our campaigning for the online safety bill, we were really pushing the idea that children need a voice in this regime, that ultimately technology platforms, the decision makers in government, aren't listening to the voices and experience of children because they see them as just children or just other users. And it's really important because children have views on what works, what doesn't work, and ultimately they are the people using these platforms more and experience probably some of the worst forms of harm. So part of our objectives going forwards is to really make sure that we can ensure that children's voices are inputting and informing the decisions of the regulator. And I think that's really important because as the regulator starts to put forward its codes of practice, we need to make sure that they're as ambitious as possible. We need to make sure that they have legitimacy in the eyes of children, that children can see the benefit in the changes that are being made, and that, that ultimately they do work. There's also another angle to this, which is about early warning. Now, children and young people are the people using the next upcoming app, whether it's Be Real or the next thing in the future. They're the people who are exposed to new trends before us adults do. They're not using Facebook, they're barely using Instagram anymore. It's a real shift from how we as adults see the online world. And it's really important that we can get those views across, because when there are new and emerging harms, that we can raise them with the platforms and with the regulator. Now, I said during our campaigning we tried to get a formal mechanism in place for children and young people to be able to input. That wasn't possible for a range of reasons. But as the NSPCC, we're looking to try and embody that as much as possible. So part of our strategy going forwards is around amplifying the voices and experience of young people. So we're going to do that for a number of ways. One is we're recruiting right at this second a panel, a youth panel, so 13 to 16-year-olds who will work with us to help inform our online safety influencing. So if anyone knows any interested 13 to 16-year-olds, do get in touch with me afterwards, and I'll let you know about that. We're also utilising the evidence base that we have available to us. We also run Childline, so there's lots of information that comes through there that can start to play part of that early warning system. And we're also commissioning evidence. And with that, we want to be able to go to our colleagues in the regulator and say, this is the harm that we're seeing, these are the ways that we think it should be tackled, and hopefully start that process of regulation working and giving Ofcom the evidence base it needs to move forwards. The other thing I'll just say while I've got the mic is we're really keen to make sure that wherever possible, there aren't incentives for platforms not to be regulated or to try and avoid their duties. And I'm just thinking in the backdrop of Meta last week announcing the rollout of end-to-end encryption, the technology across their platforms, starting with Messenger, but ending with Instagram over the next 9 months. That places children at a significant risk at the moment. And I do think that the timing of that isn't coincidental, the fact that a lot of Ofcom's powers haven't come into effect yet. So we will be doing everything we can to make sure there is still pressure on these companies, especially ones that are trying to avoid scrutiny, to protect children.
Thanks. And I think, you know, the voice of NGOs in this and also young people is going to be really important. We've had a safety advisory council in Europe and in other regions, which is populated by NGOs to share their expertise on all sorts of issues related to online harms. But we realized that youth voices weren't, you know, they were being represented in there by proxy, and we actually announced a couple of months ago that we were launching our own youth panel. So hopefully we're not competing for the same young people. There's also going to be kind of super complaints within the regime, which I know DCIT is consulting on at the minute. I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of highlight in there, or a shout out for people in the room to respond to the consultation.
Of course. I mean, everyone go read it, respond to it, etc. Very exciting piece of policy work. But on a more serious note, I think, like, we've already heard from like colleagues in Ofcom, but I think super complaints is one example of a lot of different functionality elements of the regime that we've tried to build into, like, exactly in the way you're saying, make sure that the regime is genuinely responsive to new harms. Right? I think we're going to get onto this talking about AI, but the whole online safety regime is designed to be living and breathing and continuously updated, and not just a static rule book that's put in place. Yeah,
I mean, maybe we should just touch on that kind of. Yeah, how do we deal with the emerging technologies? We've had the AI summit last month. I think AI is probably when we talk about emerging technology, probably the one that people most focus on because it's in the news most, and I think where the most attention is at. But kind of, is the approach to emerging tech, is that all covered by the Act, or is there a different approach that you're planning as the department?
Yeah, so I think it's worth, you know, thinking back to what I said in response to your first query, that the Online Safety Act is not the Fix the Internet Act, right? It is designed with particular conceptions of harms and particular conceptions of services that need to be operating responsibly in mind. So That's why the government is, looking at AI more widely as a technology, it's consulted on an AI white paper, it's undertaken the AI summit more recently, etc., and is considering AI as a much broader general purpose technology that's going to be integrated across the economy beyond just content generation. But that's not to say that AI won't clearly have consequences for the online world. It won't clearly, as we've already heard in the classroom, have potential consequences for children's safety. And I think what I would first stress is that we as officials in DCIT have been really, really careful to try and design this legislation in a way that is future-proofed and is as technology neutral as possible. So that means that it's irrelevant whether a piece of content or criminal activity is undertaken using artificial intelligence or undertaken using normal traditional human methods. It will be caught and captured in the regime consistently with how we treat other types of content. So that means if you generate some harmful content using AI, put it on a social media platform, it's captured. It means if a search engine is using AI, it's captured. It means if a pornography website is ultimately an AI image generation service that generates pornography to go for you, that is captured. And of course, there will be new issues and there will be new things at the forefront that we need to work through at a more detailed level. But I think my challenge would be actually when we're talking about AI, how much of this stuff is fundamentally new, right? And how much of this is scale and speed and accessibility of things that we're already seeing and we already have quite a robust evidence base to understand how to deal with.
Well, I'd love to come in there. No, I completely agree with the point that these harms that we're seeing from AI, especially from the NSPCC's perspective, aren't necessarily new harms. We did a bit of scouring of Childline recently to see where children had called us up about issues related to particularly generative AI. And it was really quite interesting. We had examples of essentially either peer-to-peer or adult-to-peer creation of synthetic CSAM. So either adults creating it or children creating it of potentially classmates. And the impact of that on children was really distressing, as you can imagine, no different from if they had been sending nudes themselves and it had been received. We had examples of people using it to sextort people, so financially extort them and try and get money off them. We had examples of peer-to-peer bullying by using generative AI to create videos, portraying a child saying something that they didn't say. We had examples of children who were speaking to chatbots that had given them really inappropriate advice, like you might have depression or anxiety, things that they're not designed to produce. And I guess ultimately it goes back to that point. These aren't new harms. These are harms that we know about, but generative AI is creating a sort of a new frontier for how that can be, how children can feel that. And ultimately, if we go back to the principles of why we had an online safety bill, it was around making sure that technology companies, when they design their products, that they are safe by design, that when they start to create products, they think, what are the implications of doing this? How could it be exploited? How could it be abused? How could people get around the outside of this? And I think there's still a job for us to make sure that some of the companies that might not be regulated, even though that the content is, are still thinking of things through this lens so that we don't have to retrofit solutions afterwards.
And if I add like an Ofcom regime sort of lens to this, I think there's several sort of areas of focus. So one is, as Rich said, as services introduce new design choices or new technological features, actually they have to redo their risk assessments. And that will ascertain whether they're still able to meet their safety duties. And if not, then how are they going to mitigate those risks that are, present on their services from the introduction of the new technology? From an Ofcom perspective, we are establishing very close information sharing relationships with a range of operational partners so that we're in a really strong space in terms of identifying new tech risks. And we have dedicated teams that then look at those tech risks, and we're really fortunate in Ofcom to have a range of experts from a range of different disciplines, really skilled technologists and economists and policymakers to be able to have a look at, see what is the impact of the latest emerging tech risk on our policy, on the regime, on legislation, but also on enabling the harm. And some of these risks, obviously, have a cross harm impact. It's not just about CSA. What we do find in CSA is that offenders are very agile at taking new technology and manipulating it to enable online offending at scale very quickly. So actually, it's really important for us to stay ahead of the curve and for our codes to be very agile so we can update and foresee what's happening and start the research quickly into mitigations and looking at how the impact of these emerging risks and new technologies provide for services.
And if I could just add, I think taking a step back from this, it's also, I think, worth reflecting on the fact that as a policy community, as a civilization, basically, we are in a much better position, I think, dispositionally, facing sort of the coming wave of AI developments than we were last time around with the advent of social media, because I think there is a widespread sort of view that we probably didn't come to the appropriate conclusions about the risks and didn't ultimately act quickly enough as a society around some of the problems we're now seeing. And I think that certainly a lot of the conversations I'm seeing in the policy community, within civil society, I'd be interested to know whether individuals are seeing this sort of in the staff rooms, etc., is that people are coming at AI as a technology with their eyes open and understanding that there probably are going to be a next generation of risks and harms associated. So we've already started the thinking, we've started the work, and I think we're in a much better position than we would otherwise be.
Yeah, and I think that's reflected in the business community as well. You know, we launched in 2018, and I think from there you can learn a lot of lessons from the previous decade or so of online platforms and the challenges that they face, and then think about the design of your platform and, you know, how you can try to design out risk and harm rather than just remove it when it appears in the first place. So that's something we think really closely about. It's just kind of another question for the panel was really around a lot of the people online today, but also in person, they work with young people, they work with children, and they work in online safety. And we've talked a lot about the Online Safety Act and the regime and how it applies to companies. But I guess kind of for those in the audience, how do you think that they should work in collaboration? We heard David in the previous session talk about the professional online safety helpline, about the revenge porn helpline, but kind of are there more ways that government or the regulator and teachers and parents kind of work together to kind of improve safety together rather than just kind of through a regulatory regime? I'll start with Sarah, if I can pick on you.
Yeah, sure. I think it comes down to that close partner working again to make sure that Ofcom aren't doing anything in isolation of the wider system. And it's really important to us we have those really strong links with a range of sectors, particularly NGOs, in this space. So a great example is we have some measures out for consultation at the moment, which will provide frictions in the grooming journey. So will help to prevent offenders from contacting children and starting to groom them. To be able to have education in the classroom level of why we are recommending particular features and why there are particular safety settings, and to really help with that decision making as children and young people about why should they not really try and turn them off, you know, because actually it's there to protect you, there to help you. Those sort of things like that, I think, will be where you sort of almost see that thread from us as policymakers wanting to recommend something. There is something there about awareness about, and we have recommended something called supported messaging because we've done a lot of research into this. And actually, when a child or young person goes to block someone or wants to mute them or wants to go to disable a safety setting, that we have something, whether it's a pop-up or some other way that actually tries to provide some supported messaging and some, you know, some links to resources and to understanding to help that child in their decision-making process, because actually they don't always understand the risks online. They don't understand why some of these settings are in place. Not all children are online using children accounts, right? They're not always. And so this comes into a much bigger piece that we're looking at in terms of Ofcom. But there is that thread, I think, in terms of that awareness of children. The onus isn't on the children to have to keep themselves safe and have to be the ones that report. It should be on the services to, you know, absolutely comply with their safety duties and keep children safe. But there is something there about children understanding what we're trying to protect. And that's what Rich was saying earlier in terms of that engagement piece with children and young people on things like our draft measures is really important. we are absolutely aware that, you know, as Hugh said, there's not been a huge amount of sort of control or regulation in the past on the internet. So actually, when you start to put in safety settings, some children, young people are going to find that quite restrictive. And we're fully aware of that. And we're very conscious as well of rights to privacy, of freedom of expression when we are recommending measures. And it's really important to us to work with, you know, organisations such as NSPCC to make sure we are capturing that child voice and understanding when we are looking at our mitigations.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, it's just there. Just moving on, I guess one of the challenges here is that, you know, the internet doesn't stop at the borders of the UK, and many of the services that people will use will be global. I was wondering if you could kind of talk through either the work that's been put into the Online Safety Act to kind of reflect that, but also kind of best practice that you might have seen from, you know, whether that's the Digital Service Act or the OSMAR in Ireland, or, you know, many different pieces of legislation. I know Australia has a big online safety regime. So I guess just kind of looking abroad, if there are any kind of best practice examples or ways in which the Act is able to reflect those.
Yeah, happy to give this one a go. I suppose, yeah, it's a really difficult question, and we were reflecting on that a lot as the NSPCC. What's our role in trying to influence other pieces of legislation? Because obviously the N stands for national, and the next closest piece of legislation that we thought we might have a role in influencing was the European legislation on preventing child sexual abuse. And there's a real Brexit dynamic to that meant that there's probably a problematic way of us getting involved, but actually there's a lot of learning that we can share, learning on using, you know, systems and processes regulation, taking risk assessments and pushing that upon companies. I guess what I've seen internationally as possibly some of the best examples is maybe coming out of Australia, and their e-safety directive have been really using transparency tools to force companies to explain what they're doing and why. And I think that's really important, because you need platforms to be able to explain to every one of us why are the decisions they're making and what the impacts will be. And with that information, it provides us with a lot of sort of expertise to design appropriate solutions, appropriate mitigations to those harms. I guess the next step that I will be quite excited to see coming from the UK, once we start to see risk assessments come through from the platforms, I'd really like to see us get into a stage where someone, whoever that is, starts to summarise that for general members of the public, for parents, for teachers, so we have a dashboard of what good looks like based on the risk assessments that platforms are performing. But, you know, keeping up to date will be an absolute nightmare. So I hope it doesn't fall to the NSPCC.
I'll take that one away and have a look for you, Rich. And I think there's another dimension to that as well, with the increased transparency and increased information about what services are or aren't doing to keep you safe online. Really empowers everybody as a user to really make decisions about which services they actually do want to use or perhaps move to. There's something really powerful there about actually knowing more about what a service is or isn't doing to keep you or your children safe.
Obviously, agree with all that. I think coming back to the international question, I was reflecting on this quite a bit as well, and I think there are some very obvious senses in which international collaboration is important. You know, just empowering our regulator to work with other regulators, etc. And as you've said, the internet doesn't stop at our borders, and so trying to ensure a consistent, safe online experience, no matter where the company is based or what regimes they might be subject to, etc., is really important. But I think also, everyone on the panel today has said the phrase systems and processes quite a lot, and I think like we sort of take that, certainly like the policy community, take that for granted. But I think it's worth reflecting that we, alongside other Western nations that have been, you know, a bit more forward-footed in this area, have been pushing forward this process of this approach of systems and processes-based regulation. And I think that's really, really important from an international perspective, because previously, in sort of the previous generation of conversations about internet regulation, you kind of had this squared-off debate between freedom of speech versus this idea of state-mandated takedown regimes, etc. And that is not what this regime is, right? This regime, as you've already said, is about just ensuring that proper, proportionate, responsible business processes are the way that these companies are running themselves. So what that provides is a model for online safety to other regimes where governments might be more of a disposition to intervene in individual level speech, and it provides a blueprint for that kind of regulation that balances safety with individuals and ultimately children's rights online as well.
And just to finish with that, on the international perspective, there is now an established global online safety regulators network, and Ofcom is just in the process of taking over the chair. eSafety chaired it for the first year, and that for us is a really good opportunity to start to share information and to align our approaches. And you know, we're really keen that other countries that have been sort of maybe considering this are sort of watching what's happening, how it's playing out. And, you know, the idea will be that more countries, start to put up their own draft legislation, and actually we can get more global alignment, because we absolutely understand that the internet is not carved up by different countries. There are no geographical boundaries online. So the more that we can align and deconflict internationally, the more impact we can have globally.
Thanks, everyone. I'd love to go to the audience for some questions, because we've got 3 great experts, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions from the audience. So can we start just here?
Thank you. So I've got a question. We kind of lock our systems down at school, so we use various filtering and monitoring, and I'm very proactive digitally and with AI. Our challenge actually comes when the children are at home, in terms of them accessing harmful content. And I'm thinking things like self-harm, suicide ideation, and so on. And it's what can we do as educators to help our parents that maybe don't have this understanding. And it's almost as soon as the child has got a device, then it's almost too late. It's, you know, you almost think that these NCT classes now are going to be the time to start speaking to prospective parents about what sort of features they should have in terms of lockdown systems. And at the moment, the only ones that we can recommend to as a school are the paid ones, where, you know, they sign up all their devices and then they place their restrictions there. But what are Ofcom and the government going to do to target parents as well as support schools?
Shall I start and then you come in? Cool. So I think the first thing I'd say is that I think part of the intent of this legislation is to actually is to try and take pressure away from having to recommend those kind of tools to parents individually, and taking pressure away from parents in an individual-based approach to looking after child well-being online. Fundamentally what the Online Safety Act means now is that the responsibility is on the services where that content can be encountered to prevent or mitigate the risk or impact of children encountering that content in the first place. So pornography publishers will have to age-gate their sites from the point of that being that relevant part of the legislation being enforced. Likewise, major social media platform search services will have to, according to the risk assessments Ofcom set out, determine the way children might interact or find that content and make changes to their services to prevent that from happening. So I'm not saying there's not a role for working with teachers and parents, but I think a big part of the legislation is to take pressure away from that as the most important course of action.
How long do you reckon that will actually come into effect? We're encountering this now.
Totally, and I totally take the point that this isn't an overnight solution. The regime is tranched, so we're not implementing everything at the same time. The consultation on the harms we care most about, which is illegality and criminal harms, the consultation's already out the door. We expect that to close early next year, and I think current expectations are we expect that to be fully enforced towards the end of next year. Likewise, that will be followed quite swiftly by pornography and children's safety more broadly. So fast, but ultimately, as you say, there is still time to go before that's enforced.
And we have a consultation coming out in May next year, which is exactly about some of the things that you mentioned in terms of the legal but harmful content that children are finding being pushed at them online. So that will be going out as a Protected Children consultation in May and draft. Really keen that as many practitioners as possible engage with that and give us feedback about what you're seeing. And also, you know, if you have evidence of harms to feed into that, that's really useful. And then after that, there's a consultation that will be going out about user empowerment. And we also have a media literacy program called Making Sense of Media, which is about absolutely demystifying some of this and raising awareness and empowering users to understand about risks and safety online. But I really don't want to take away from some of the brilliant education packages that are out there, and I won't take away from Rich. I'll let him come in and talk about those. But actually, they're really important because the messaging that is created there by absolute experts in a way that can get through to children and young people, in a way that can raise awareness of parents and carers to do really simple things like sit and having conversations with your child, like how many parents really take much interest in what their children are doing online. You know, it looks like they're on some game, it looks boring, whatever, but actually having those conversations, that dialogue, creating that trusted space at home, you know, where that environment is available, or through guardians or carers, etc., if possible, to be able to have open conversations if they encounter something that's worrying or upsetting, and feel that they can actually have the conversation, that someone's interested in what they're doing. That starts to open the door in another part of their lives that actually at the moment quite generally is kept quite closed. And, you know, I do it myself sometimes with my daughters looking at something, but actually just sit and go, what are you looking at? And just sort of ask those questions, sort of starts that engagement. But I'll pass over to you, Rich, because I know you've got some excellent education resources and things you've been doing over the years.
Yeah, thanks. I think I agree with everything said. Ultimately, regulation is going to be part of the solution, but it's not a silver bullet, and we can't be just reliant on, you know, giving up everything else. I think those open conversations are incredibly important, and I suppose the area I'll just point people to is obviously Childline and Helpline are two incredible resources for people to access. Children obviously can call Childline and have those, you know, impartial conversations with a practitioner about anything that can be concerning them. And often, a lot of those calls that come to us are about mental health issues. They're about people seeing inappropriate content, whether it's suicide, self-harm, pro-anorexia, eating disorder content. We get a lot of that, and it's about having those open, trusted conversations to point people into the right direction. And obviously for practitioners who are worried about children, they can also get in touch with the NSPCC helpline.
Yeah, and I think the previous panel said something around kind of parents as well, having, you know, little time, you know, between jobs and everything else to really focus on this issue. And we did some research with Internet Matters last year with teachers and with parents, and it included a kind of SLT as well as Frontline. And the feedback there was a real appetite for resources, particularly around TikTok, because they weren't as familiar with it from their everyday lives. So we produced a specific teacher playbook that was sent, and the concept of that was from the feedback of the research, which was you can put this into you know, the student's backpack so that it can go home and that the parent can understand how to use the family pairing tools, how to enable different content filtering tools and all of those. I am conscious of time, but there was another question just down here we could take quickly for the panel.
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate the fact that we are in schools at a crisis point to do with children's mental health. And I think it's kind of easily forgotten or underestimated the impact that negative social media posts, harmful content can have on young people. And I understand regulation is just one tool in our toolkit, but I'm curious to know, what role do you think levies, financial levies on the companies such as TikTok and Meta? If you think about fuel, it's taxed. If you think about water companies, they discharge effluent into the rivers, they get taxed. There's a levy. There's a corporate social responsibility that I do think the likes of TikTok and other companies do need to acknowledge, because on the front line, we have children every day in crisis points. And the government has finite resources, schools have finite resources, but corporate social responsibility from the likes of TikTok and others would actually go a significant way as a gesture of your positive ethos and values to reducing the harms that are impacting young people on a day-to-day basis. So I guess the question is mostly for TikTok, because the work that you three are doing is commendable and your hands are tied, as are ours in schools. So really, for TikTok and other likes, and those of you online, please do chip in. What can you do and what are you willing to do to put your money where your metaphorical mouths are to help us?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's actually something that was covered earlier in the legislative process. I think firstly, we need to look at the app, right? We need to make sure that there's default safety security settings in there to make sure that children are having a safe and secure environment. We need to make sure that parents are able to use those tools to help guard that experience. That's all on the app, and the kind of experiences that you're talking about is, what do we do in schools, how do we work, and, Southwest Grid for Learning are one partner of ours, Internet Matters are another, and we produce a large amount of resources and support looking at how we can make sure that we get the expertise that we have about our platform and get that to those teachers and get that to those parents so that they can enable things that aren't already on by default. So to give you an example of some of those, so we enabled kind of 1 hour screen time limits by default for under 18s. We did that in consultation with Boston Children's Wellness Lab. And that was one of the things where I think we've gone quite far in terms of how we can protect children and what the right level of well-being is. But on the specific issue of levies, I recall this was touched on in the Internet Safety Strategy Green Paper, kind of very early on in this process. It was consulted on by government as to, is this the appropriate way forward? And I think kind of across the board, there was kind of not a large amount of support of it, including from the NGO community, and I don't want to speak for Rich, but because, we already have specific partnerships with different NGOs in areas that we think we need to focus most on, so we may be focusing on well-being, but if you are a messaging app that's images, actually what you want to focus more on is, CSA and prevention of distribution of imagery. So there was actually some opposition in that consultation from NGOs at the time. It was 2017, I think, because you want to focus on what the potential harms are on that service and making sure that we are focusing on those and not actually what's happening on another platform. But I'll just hand over in case there are any points.
Yeah, just a quick one on that. So for my sins, I used to be a water regulator. So I've sort of got a good view of the system there. And one thing that we did was when we find companies, instead of finding them, you often hear in sort of The Guardian, it's £150 million fine, all this sort of stuff. What we actually did was find them £1 and made them spend that £150 million on other things that matter to their customers. So I guess the question here is, and I don't know how it's looking to work in the regime going forwards, is where do the fines that will go to, that will be on companies, where do they actually end up? And can they actually be fed back into the system to help prevent or respond to harms that have already happened?
So I'll just come in on over points. So I won't want to bore everyone with the fact there are lots of very complicated reasons, etc., why you might want to spend money one way or the other in government. But I would say that we did think about this, and actually we came to a relatively similar conclusion to, I think, what you're proposing, which is that it would not be appropriate for the taxpayer to bear the burden of a regulatory regime put in place to basically hold platforms to account, which is why an oft overlooked part of the regime is that Ofcom is fully funded by an industry levy. So we are not currently in the regime taking fines and distributing them to various bits of government spending, but the entire regulatory regime, which will be quite expensive, is fully funded by industry.
We are over time by 4 minutes, but I would encourage everyone in the break to grab our speakers and ask them more questions if you can. We have a 15-minute break now, I believe, for people to grab teas, coffees, sandwiches, etc. So, yeah, please enjoy. Thank you. And thanks to the panel.
We welcome you all back for the last session, for the panel discussion about youth and digital well-being. Thank you so much for coming back, by the way. All of the coffee, cookies were just a bribe to keep you here. Thank you so much for taking it and staying here as well. My dear panelists, please take the stage. We have Dr. Nikki Su, harmful content and digital well-being expert at TikTok. Dr. Amy Orban, Program Leader, Track Scientist at Cambridge University, and Carl Hopwood, member of UK Council for Internet Safety. We will be discussing for the next 30 minutes digital youth digital well-being. Thank you so much for coming, the three of you. You look lovely, and we have an awesome audience today in front of us and hundreds of people online, which we say hello once more. Please send your questions in. And if we don't get to answer some of your questions, we'll write articles about it. So keep following SWGfL, and we'll get the answers to your questions. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to have the same 30-minute structured discussion and 10-minute Q&A. I'll pose questions to you. It's a huge topic, and I don't mean just general digital well-being, but especially about youth and children. So thank you so much for engaging with this topic with us today. So my first question will be at Amy then. I mean, it's rather a basic one, but I think for the benefit of us all, what is our general understanding of digital well-being? What should parents and teachers, all of us as responsible adults, all positive digital role models, be looking out for? Is it how long are people spending time online? What they're watching? What's the case there?
Well, thanks for organizing this. I don't actually think it's that simple. So probably shouldn't ask the academic who works in a kind of with a lot of clinicians and mental health professionals to talk about digital well-being, because actually the definition is really difficult. So well-being itself is inherently complicated. What makes us feel good on a day-to-day basis is determined by everything from genetics and our home environment to our social environment and to the world we live in general. And so I guess if we take the term on face value, we're talking about things like life satisfaction. If you ask somebody, how happy are you? How to report on that. But often when we talk about well-being, sometimes we also drift into mental health. So where we talk about maybe things like anxiety or depression. And there, again, it's different if you talk about that in the general population. So any of us feeling more or less depressed at any one time or anxious at any one time. Or in a population of young people who are struggling and, for example, would be able to be diagnosed with, for example, an anxiety disorder. And I feel like the role of the digital, while we often talk about it in this broad brush account, I think probably is very different for different stages. So, for example, talking with a researcher on working in the suicide field recently, who was saying, even if we just think about suicidal ideation and then maybe following through with these suicidal thoughts, technology can have very different impacts at different points in time. They can raise our sort of general risk level, but then, for example, in times of crises, the impact might be very different, and it might be different things having the impact. So I think I just want to make us aware that when we talk about well-being, we often mean a lot of different things, and I feel like technology will interact with all of them in different ways. So, and then if we think about this mental health or well-being being a really complicated concept, the digital is as much so. So I often now say when people like simple answers about how the technological world relates to well-being, well, it's the technological world, there's now so much of young people's lives that are spent in digital environments that it's more or less just as complicated as everyday life. And so, for example, even the question of how does interacting with your family at Christmas impact your well-being? It's a really hard question. You would need to know, what's your family structure like? How was your previous, interactions? How was the stress level? And so I think that inherently comes back to that. I don't think it's just time. Just like time spent with your family isn't relevant as such as understanding what your interaction with them are over Christmas lunch. But it's also not just content. It's also how things are designed. Where my team's very interested in things like quantification of feedback, and what that does for adolescents who really care about what other people think about them. So I think my general idea is it's very complicated. However, if we zoom in on very specific questions, for example, what are young people who are struggling with anxiety or struggling with an eating disorder or struggling with self-harm, if we zone in on specific questions like that, I think we can get quite far in understanding what matters. But it probably won't be just time. There might be some questions where time matters, but not all of them.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I hope that wasn't too academic.
No, I appreciate it. And we're well aware that the Online Safety Day, as well as the launchpad for the Safer Internet Day in February, is also every year opening new questions and new issues, and we're fully aware with that. So I'm honored and really pleased we have Dr. Nikki Su, which is a digital well-being expert at TikTok and harmful content and digital well-being expert at TikTok. So the question is, from the perspective of TikTok, what are platforms' approaches to these issues, however complex they are? Do you think and should young people, how could we help young people maintain a healthy balance between their online and offline lives, especially coming from a platform?
Thanks, Boris. And I completely, I think, have to echo what Amy was talking about, it being quite complicated, and we try to pursue this in a few number of ways. And I hope, me talking about TikTok's approach can help us think a little bit more about maybe some broader learnings, and maybe it's useful, but happy to answer more questions. So for us, I think we take it first and foremost from quite a holistic approach. We know there's no one solution, and some of the things we do from the get-go, which I think Ben did touch a bit about earlier, was firstly ensuring that we can make it a safe, age-appropriate environment for young people. So I know a lot of them, we talked about how it's a big part of their life now. As they're starting to explore, their online environment, can we make sure that they have the guardrails in place? So we talked about this a little bit earlier, accounts from 16 and under, private by default. We have screen time muted notifications. So for example, for those 13 to 15, they won't get any notifications from TikTok from 9 p.m. and then no notifications for those from 16 to 17 from 10 p.m. Some of the ways we've learned and been able to understand a little bit more about what we should do and learn and apply is partner and collaborate with experts like Amy. We do this a number of ways. We have a whole function called Outreach and Partnerships in our Trust and Safety team, and their main role there is to really help us link up with experts, academics, NGOs, which allows us to commission research and learn more from the people that we're actually talking about here. So we speak to teens and parents, which really helps us understand their perceptions, their views, and allows us to co-create tools with them. So one example here, I know we're not just talking about time or screen time, but we wanted to understand a little bit more about the role of agency when it comes to intentional use of online platforms and also just spending time online in general. So we commissioned work with Internet Matters, and we did focus groups in 5 different countries in the UK and Europe. We asked young people and parents to tell us a little bit more about what agency online meant to them and how can we actually support you online, to whether it's features or tools, and how does it actually make you feel. And some of the feedback we got in the findings was that they wanted more information. So in order to support their intentional use and make those decisions, they wanted to understand a bit more about what they were actually doing, so how much time they were spending. They wanted a little bit more flexibility, so they know, just like all of us, we have different demands on our time, during a weekday, the night before an exam, versus a weekend or a holiday. So they wanted some flexibility with the features. And then finally, they wanted more active alerts. So they completely understood that, yes, we might have some other things to do, like our homework or whatever like that. But just like you and I, nobody, I think, really likes to be interrupted in the middle of something, but to be reminded, hey, you've got a few minutes of what you were intending to do next. Here's a little reminder. So it helps get them kind of started to think about, I'm going to move on to the next task. So what we've done in practice in response to that research, which is found and available online, is invest in developing some of the tools that you actually see on the app, and building on things that we already had. So we have a new screen time dashboard that we announced last year, which actually not only breaks down how much time you're spending online day and night, but we also by default send everyone under 18 a summary in their inbox about how much time they're using. So again, really supporting the intentional use so that they can make that decision, it's not just what I'm doing, but how much time I'm choosing to do and when. So those are just some of the examples. They also told us they wanted more support in reflecting on their habits. So we also created 7 digital tips with Boston Children's Hospital and Internet Matters. which is available on our safety center as well. So again, those questions are like, how is that time actually making you feel? Like, did you learn something? Did you then go off and like, you know, do something with your friends? So it allows them to kind of think a little bit more about not just in isolation, like this is just one thing I've done online, but how does that relate to the rest of your offline kind of world? But of course, like Amy mentioned earlier, we know that screen time's just part of a wider picture, so we want to support their interactions and their use online of our platform in a more customized way, like thinking about what they're seeing. So there are a number of ways we've actually supported and empowered our users. So we've got a reset button that you can completely like reset your For You feed like a brand new user. You can also use the non-personalized feed. So if you don't feel like having anything customized to what you like, you can just watch the most popular hits in your country. And then the other thing is that you can actually filter out what you are not really interested in. So again, like allows you to decide completely what you want to look at. But of course, like we're always iterating, improving, and I think the other part of the important picture here is supporting the community around the young person. So we have lots of tools and resources, not just on our safety center, but also like through our family pairing feature. So parents can link their account with the young person's account and then help to decide on like what works for them. So what settings, like privacy settings or like screen time settings or content settings that actually work best. So these are just some of the things we're thinking about and we've done, but we're always kind of like learning from new research and things like that. So I'm sure there'll be more updates in a couple of months.
No, thank you so much for sharing them. A plethora of resources. And before coming to Carl, and I think I want to connect it with the question as well, what we heard from Dr. Orban and Dr. Sue as well about issues and challenges, the further understanding that we do need in the field of understanding what digital well-being is, and then how to explain it to general public. But at the same time, we need to understand that parents and educators, as we heard here often, do play a significant part. So what do you think, what role do parents and educators play in promoting positive digital well-being for young people? Easy question for you, Carl.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Boris. I think the first thing I would say, you know, if you think about teachers, and I used to be a teacher, so I totally get what some colleagues in the room have been saying about, you know, things feel like they're at breaking point. Young people are desperately in need of support. And I think one thing I would say is that teachers mustn't always assume, and nor must parents always assume, that social media is the problem. It often is the problem, but it can often be the solution as well. I think if you look at some of Ofcom's research, for example, yes, you know, we often see the stuff in the mainstream media that talks about the challenges, but often underreported is the fact that something like, I think it was 87% of 12 to 15-year-olds said, you know, using social media makes me feel happy, helps me to feel closer to my friends. And I think what we've got to try and do in schools in particular is try and create a space where it is okay to talk about the things that are happening, the things that you're seeing, but they can't feel that they're going to be blamed for doing that. And if I'll give you an example, I was in a school last week and there was a child in year 6 who, let's be clear, isn't supposed to be using social media platforms at all, but we all know that they do. And they'd been exposed to some really challenging content connected with what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And they explained it to me in quite graphic detail, and it sounded absolutely horrific, which I think we can all, you know, understand. But they hadn't told anybody. That's the point, Boris. They hadn't told anybody because they thought, you know what I'm going to say, that actually their parents were going to say, right, let's have the device. You can't use, I won't say which platform it was, but you can't use that particular platform. And just to kind of respond to something Nikki said, you know, I know that the tech companies are putting an awful lot of, you know, tools and supports in place for younger users. But this particular pupil had told the platform that she was 39 because she's using her parents' date of birth, and so none of the amazing things that the platforms are then putting in place are actually being applied. But to get back to the question, Boris, sorry, I'm going off on one. I think in terms of what teachers can do, I think they need to listen to young people. You guys actually, in the Safer Internet Centre, did some research that came out on Safer Internet Day last year, this year rather, which found that 30% of 8 to 17-year-olds said the online safety lessons that I get in school, they don't allow me to talk about the things that I actually want to talk about. So that's a waste of everybody's time, and I think we need to evaluate what we're doing. I know it's very easy to say, oh, evaluate, but I think in schools we've traditionally been really good at evaluating the impact of a maths intervention, let's just say. But I think we need to do that with online safety, because when you talk to young people, they're very good at saying, oh, yeah, I would do this, and I'd do this, and I definitely wouldn't do that. And then they go away and do the exact opposite. So I think it's about translating the kind of theory into their behavior. I also think, as teachers, we need to think about the vulnerable users. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I think some of the research that we're getting is very clear that actually there are different groups who are a lot more likely to be affected by some of this harmful content, so we need to be sort of mindful of that. But I also think it's really important that we don't victim blame. And here I'd just give a kind of shout out to some of the UK Council for Internet Safety guidance. Schools are probably aware that last October there was some victim blaming guidance came out challenging victim blaming language. Most schools don't know about it, so we've got to be better at kind of promoting that. And I honestly do believe, and I know I'm in an audience of many teachers here, but I think every school in the country will have somebody on the staff who, when it becomes apparent that, you know, somebody shared a nude image, for example, somebody is thinking, oh, you know, how many times have we got to talk about this? What were they thinking? Why on earth did... Well, they're not going to come forward and tell us that things are wrong, that they're struggling with their mental health and well-being, if that's the kind of response that they get. And I think with parents, I would just quickly say in terms of parents, they've got to model the right behaviours, haven't they? You know, I mean, if we're sort of saying you can't have phones at the dinner table, you can't have phones in your bedroom overnight, well, we need to make sure that we're not doing that as well. You know, we've got to kind of set the right example so they kind of get the good practice in place. Sorry.
No, thank you so much, Carl. Positive digital role modeling, I think it would be a good title. And thank you so much for opening that topic. We often hear that if we ask children in any of our sessions across UK and the world, what would you do if you would encounter or be in a harmful situation? In unison, they say, we would reach out to a trusted adult. And then we lean in and ask, would you? And they go, nah. And that's what's scientifically also supported. 4.7% of children who end up in those situations reach out to a trusted adult. They don't trust us. They think we're going to punish them and take their devices away and many other reasons. So I fully support that. But coming off your point, I would like to go back to Nikki. And what do we think then works? Because we know the challenges are there. We need to understand them better. We know how children are looking. What interventions, strategies that we know have proven effective in protecting a positive digital culture on one end, but as well a responsible online behavior among young people. That is going to be the society of the future.
Big question. A lot to unpack. I think, you know, like some of the things that Carl mentions really touches on some of the things that I was going to think what came to mind when you asked me that question, really. So just highlighting a couple of things. I know I talked a little bit earlier about like making resources and tools easily available, but one of the things that we try to do as much as possible, apart from actually creating these tools and working with experts and speaking to young people about what you want or what you think would be most useful for you, is actually reminding them about it. So some of the things we have done, like I talked about family pairing earlier, actually we realized that maybe not many people knew about it. And even though it's something that allows you to link your account to your child's account, multiple children if you've got more than one, we realized that, okay, people are not really aware that this is it's available. Because through events like this and talking to parents, through our research, not just on our platform, but like on others, they're not really across that. One of the things that we've actually done is try to remind people, like in our app, like resurface that, like, hey, this is something you might want to think about. Do you want to check this out? So we did what we call like an upsell. So in the app, we can like remind people or resurface like certain things so they can check it out. So that's something that we have tried to continually do, not all the time, of course, we don't want to annoy you, but just something to kind of remind people that this is an available tool in place. We also try to tailor certain things. So if you are looking for something, you can go straight to that on our safety centers. So like topic guides and resources tailored to specific topics. You talked about bullying. I know that's a topic that really, like I've actually done a conference a couple of weeks ago specifically talking about this. And people don't really know, what does that actually mean? And sometimes they were saying like, young people were saying, what if I was just, you know, when people sort of hide behind like, oh, I'm just joking, you know, how do you how do you actually come up and talk about it because you feel like, oh, am I being too sensitive? So some of the resources actually explain a little bit like not just what it actually looks like, but if you are feeling uncomfortable, these are some of the things you could do, some of the resources you could have. So even if you don't necessarily feel like there's someone you could immediately talk to in your trusted adult circle, are they some of the different resources you could look for? I mean, hopefully there's someone you could talk to, but there are other things we try to point people to as well. But, you know, apart from that, like, I think on our part as a platform, our responsibility really also comes from cultivating and supporting that positive and inclusive culture on TikTok. Some of the things that, my favorite thing really is when I talk to people and they tell me things like, oh, my favorite thing is how diverse, like, I learned from someone new what it's like to live in Greenland. And that's actually me. Like, I've actually learned so many new things about what it's like to be a person in Greenland, like having to only go to the shops like once every couple of weeks because it's impossible to get to somewhere, you know, something like that. So whether it's something they've learned, whether it's a book they've like found out about, you know, it's something that we are very passionate about, is to make sure that you feel safe so you can either explore or like express yourself. So we've got like a range of different campaigns, like whether it's like Create Kindness, is a global campaign and a video campaign. So we know that people are like, we're trying to connect on different levels, not just on the messaging, but also the kind of medium. But we also have tools that we've invested in to hopefully encourage that positive and model, again, that behavior, remind people this is the kind of behavior that we're expecting out of you. So we've got something called a kindness prompt. So for instance, if you are going to comment and it's potentially violative, so we know that maybe it would like, there's certain like words that might violate our community guidelines when it comes to bullying, for instance, or hate speech, then we will prompt you to say like, oh, is this something you really want to post? Because it might be violative, you might want to rethink what you're gonna say. And we actually found that 4 in 10 people edit that comment and not actually post that. So that's something that, you know, it's not just for young people, it's for everyone. So it's something that to remind people like, this is not what we stand for on our platform. But I think other than that, like other things, it really is continually investing in like either working with experts or in research and like creating new tools. We know like we talked a little bit about how the environment's constantly changing. So we not only have to keep ourselves abreast of like potential like new trends that are like emerging or new kind of interactions that we've not come across before, and we just have to be mindful of that. But also, I think continually talking to those young people. So Ben earlier mentioned that we've got a youth council, a global youth council. So this is one of the ways that we can continually engage with young people. But we're always also trying to work with experts through like research, like specific research I talked about earlier with Internet Matters on specific topics, to just try to make sure that we're constantly like keeping ourselves engaged with the very audience we're trying to, you know, not just protect, but also encourage that responsible, positive online behavior so that they can also then take it with them, hopefully in their offline lives as well.
I love the connection from the beginning of your point of reminding young people of the services, and then when you remind people to be kinder or nicer, 40% of them reconsider. That is a high percentage of people who decided, no, I can say it or word it differently, if only it worked in other places. Thank you so much for that. And we have, I think, left 5 minutes before we open for questions, so you can start thinking about questions. If not, Carl, let me come to you for the second to last. The words are rapid advancement of technology. I think it's like a spatial speed of advancement of technology currently. How can professionals stay on top of it? I know it's the same question we keep repeating, but again, as Dr. Sue as well, maybe repetition, and some of our lovely people watching us online as well can remember where they can go and adapt their approaches to youth digital well-being.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question, and I often say to colleagues, you know, this is all I worry about now, this is all I do, online safety, but, you know, I think teachers have got this massive portfolio of all these other things that they're told that they're responsible for as well. I think one of the things that frustrates me slightly is that there's a lot of really useful research being done in this space, you know, and we've heard about some of it tonight, Ofcom here, Internet Matters and so on. I think, you know, we need to be able to kind of learn from that there's no point if we kind of get the research and say, oh, that's very interesting, and then you kind of pull out the lesson plan that you used last year. You have to kind of adapt. And I think if you kind of think back over the years, you know, the whole approach has changed. Many people in this room will have used those COP videos, and I used them, but they used victim-blaming language, and we know that now, and we know that we shouldn't be using them any longer. So I think, we kind of need to rely, Boris, to be fair, on people like the UK Safer Internet Centre, on Internet Matters, London Grid for Learning are here. There's lots of people who I think can kind of try and summarise and pull out the key points in that research for us. But then there still has to be time to do it, and I know that Keeping Children Safe in Education says, all staff should be trained in online safety, updated at least annually. Well, that's great, but what does that mean in your school? Is it a 10-minute slot in a staff meeting when everyone's absolutely, done in because it's this time of the year and this is when the inset day is? Or actually, do we have a couple of hours where we can really dig in to some of the things that we're trying to discuss here? So I think it's hard. I think using other organisations is important. But I also think, sometimes it's about listening to young people. And I've already said it once, but actually if you want to know what the latest things are, the Ofcom data is great, but actually what about in your particular school? They may be using an app that actually nobody else has been using for some reason, and it's suddenly caught on. So I think we've got to listen to them and really kind of, try and create that environment where there might be some peer-to-peer learning and so on, and actually embrace it and sort of make sure that youth voice is authentic and actually makes a difference. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And coming for the last question before we open up for the floor and online questions to Dr. Orban. Again, a flurry of easy questions, an easy question to end with. Are there any, not are there, what are there and are there any emerging trends and issues coming that we see through the research that professionals should be particularly attentive to?
I was really considering which ones because there's a lot. It's a really fast-moving space, and I do this as my job. I kind of lead a research team. We're funded by governmental funders, and we struggle. And so I wanted to highlight two things that I think are the most interesting and I think we should reflect on. So the first is that increasingly when we talk to young people, social media is inherently more about content consumption than it has been about sharing behaviors. And I think that's changing the way that we need to research things. So there is still sharing behavior, but it's a lot more private, kind of through snaps or through kind of direct messaging. And so there's a lot more now kind of consumption of content through apps like TikTok, which I think changes the nature of the research that we need to do to understand the impacts, because it's not just about peer-to-peer interaction or interaction in their social circle. It's about how are we crafting and molding young people in an environment where they're exploring content that is inherently individualized. So, for example, we're currently running a range of focus groups on adolescent identity development, and because that's a core feature of being a young person is trying to understand who you are and craft that. And that's not, where you end up is not a stable place. I think it's really determined throughout that time period about what you then think your sort of true self ends up being. And we always thought, oh, well, social media will help expand those horizons because it will allow you to have multiple profiles and, I can experiment with certain identities. And we do get that through the focus group. But something surprising for us was that some young people were saying, well, the apps know us so well. We're seeing what we kind of already know, and are interested in. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic that I don't yet fully understand, but I think we do need to understand because their information environments is now partially algorithmically determined. And I don't think we know enough about that yet. So I think thinking about, it's like, how you used to consume television. It's also much of consumption as well as social. I think the second is that we thought the last 10 years was fast. I think we're gonna be surprised what's down the road. I think we've always been surprised by the speed of technological change. I think just seeing, the amazing things some of my research colleagues are doing on AI chatbots for mental health. I think there's real potential. They're, training them to more or less be as good as the best sort of college counselors in, for example, an American education system. And it's just seeing what they're doing, it looks amazing. But the way we currently think about education, policy, regulation, it's all evidence-based policy making, evidence-based, interventions. However, you know, people like me are the evidence bottleneck. Like, we're like 5 years behind if we're good. If not, we're about 10 years behind. We don't have access to the necessary resources, necessary data. But, you know, I have to give evidence to parliamentarians or to policymakers, and they're waiting for that evidence to make those changes. And I just feel like that system, we've seen through social media how broken it is because the evidence isn't delivered on time. And I think, at least from the research perspective, or we need to think about delivering it quicker. So I think we need to think about where do we get our information from? If we use it, if we take it from just the sort of academic research of the past, the systems we've built on, that will, I think, will be too slow. Part of it will be talking to young people, being really receptive to what research we do, sharing our data, sharing our resources, having our place, and then working with stakeholders who also have really important knowledge, head teachers, schools, organizations on the ground. So I think we need to work together to integrate, to actually be able to respond to things in the future. Because I think what we've seen from the last 10 years is that if something really harmful comes down the road, I have no idea if we would be ready to react in the systems we have in place now. And that's coming from somebody who's in the system who would really hope that they are. But I'm struggling. I'm seeing a lot of pinch points where I think working as a community, we can maybe work on those. So that's my deep reflection about my meaning of life.
Thank you, appreciate it. It's always hard, especially in this field, and I know that I commented somewhere, we're trying to apply, at least in my opinion, like rigid frameworks to a liquid environment that's forever changing, and sometimes that brings it difficulties in itself, but thank you so much for your perspectives and understanding. And the most worried part is that the researchers are 5 to 10 years lacking or kind of behind some of those points.
Well, I think it just takes time to travel through the system. You know, we have a new app coming around. For my sort of teams, it takes us time to get funding, whether that's public university-facing research or research in organizations. Then it takes time to deliver the longitudinal data. And one of the core things my team does is provide longitudinal data analyses to then understand impact. Gosh, we first need to convince somebody, you know, in multiple committees to put in a question. There has to be a concern for a question to be put into a national data collection mechanism. And then it takes us multiple years to collect that data and then another couple of years to analyze it. So I think we need a prospective sense of what information we need, and I've been trying to convince various people to do that, and we're not there yet, but I think we will have to be at some point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm now starting to be blinded by the light. I have no idea if any hands are up. I see a hand here for a question. If anybody else wants to ask our beautiful panel, a second here and a third here, I think we're going to make it just before we have a close and then the networking opportunity. Yes, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Anastasia Diakova from Ukraine, founder and head of leading NGOs that protect children online, and we provide education and support for victims as well. And as well, it's incredible to see how world is evolved during this year especially, but together with this in Ukraine we are a little bit in totally other reality, and yesterday Russia hacked and blocked our main telecom network and like half of the country without internet, without telecom. But my question maybe will be more to Nikki about TikTok, because we as well know that Russia uses a lot social network to lead to disinformation, and in our case they target children a lot. And at the beginning of full invasion, they as well targeted children to force them to provide information to Russia about where some military troops move and all the stuff, or to make some war activities. So my question is how TikTok addresses this harmful content of disinformation or involvement children in illegal activities, because like it's one of the cases in Russia and Ukraine, but I think it's all around the world happens. So how it's possible to address?
Thank you, Anastasia. Nikki?
That's massive. I think I would love to kind of maybe have a sort of side discussion with you in more detail, but just broadly how we deal with disinformation on platform. We've got really strict rules around like harmful disinformation, so things like that, you know, cause like immediate harm to health or person. And we work with a wide range of fact checkers. We've got global fact checkers who are international fact checkers and network accredited. So we make sure that anything that we're not sure of, especially during an emergent or emerging kind of issue like a crisis, we work with them immediately. We kind of kick in that protocol to get anything that's like fact checked and make sure that that's then applied and cascaded in the kind of content in the app. Apart from that, we also have something that when something's being fact-checked, we apply something called Know the Facts label. So if something's not verified yet and it's in the middle of being verified, what we actually do is that we have a little banner at the bottom of the content that you're seeing, and that lets the person who's posted it know that their content hasn't been verified and it's being verified. It also lets the people who are viewing it see that you might not be seeing something that's completely accurate. So if they try to share it, like post to share it or to someone else, like in the DMs, for example, then they will actually have a pop-up again to remind them, look, this is not necessarily accurate yet, it's not been verified, are you sure you want to continue? So the reason why we've done that is to really provide the additional layer of like, again, reminding them that this is an intentional, giving them a moment to reflect, like, is this something you want to continue sharing onwards? So those are some of the things we do. But apart from that, anything that has to do with like, you mentioned like some of the issues could be like it's a very graphic situation. Some of those things actually do violate our community guidelines. It doesn't matter if there's a young person involved. It's just generally violent graphic content. We have a specific policy on that. Anything that has to do with children, obviously, we have additional policies relating to that. So I'd have to kind of see what we're talking about to kind of give you a more clearer idea. But this gives you an overview, I think, of what we're talking about, and happy to kind of continue that conversation later.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer. Maybe a beautiful conversation for the networking event, if I haven't mentioned, from 6 to 7. Okay, next question. Do we have an online question, or are we going here to the room? To this, I think somebody here. Thank you.
Sorry, just a quick question about the algorithms in terms of, we see young people daisy chaining themselves through more and more harmful content. And again, I come back to the eating disorders, self-harm, suicide, ideation. Is there any way that TikTok in the future would modify those algorithms, potentially put in pop-up warnings, signpost them to sites to try and move them away from that type of content?
Great question, because we actually, completely agree, appreciate those concerns. So we've actually taken those concerns on and have, in late 2021, actually started refining our algo around certain topics like diet and fitness content, sadness content, of people like expressing themselves like they're having a bad day, maybe you're seeing too much of it. Because what we do recognize is a lot of these videos may be in isolation, they might not necessarily be harmful, but again, if anything, too much of anything could potentially be harmful, so we can completely understand that, and what we've done is taken that on to refine our algorithm. But apart from that, things that you've mentioned, like suicide, self-harm content, that's definitely not allowed on our platform. But what we would do, if someone's trying to search, we've got the interventions there. We do localize the search intervention to point them to the help that they need. For example, I think in the UK it's Samaritans, but also our safety centre. So those are some of the things that we do. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Exactly the same question.
Okay.
Algorithms, but I will just ask, because we haven't mentioned misogyny, and in relation to algorithms, the sort of misogynistic content that we're seeing, and I'm just wondering in terms of identity in young people, what Amy was saying about, we need to move fast and we can't wait for those longitudinal studies, whether there's anything you could share about the impact that's having on young men's identity as well.
Thank you for the question. Panelists, are you ready to tackle this?
No.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
No, I think what we need to understand is that it is a really sensitive time and content, and what we're exposed to in any part of life shapes us. So I do think it's a really important question, and I guess Nikki can talk a bit more about how it's being combated online. But I do think and I think that's coming back to vulnerable groups and the understanding vulnerable groups, because often the impacts of technology, if you average everybody together, they're very small, and it's very difficult to understand where's a potential negative impact and how do we react to it. But the distribution around that mean is very, very large. So you'll have people having kind of on one end having a great time, you know, using it to build community, and then you have others who are, you know, actually being harmed by the platforms. And I think it's appreciating all of those. And then I think something else we need to appreciate is that people can be kind of, in the same person, there can be harm and benefit. So a good example, which is another group we often talk about in research, is LGBTQ plus kids. A lot of them say that being online is a real key, crucial part of them exploring their identity and meeting people who support them, and especially in rural locations. But then we also know that they report more bullying online and more harassment, and they can be exposed to harmful content. And both of those things can coexist for the same person as well. So I think that's where I think content does really matter. It's not just, and sometimes single pieces of content can matter. Sometimes it's everything put together. So that's my perspective, but I'll hand over to you for the more expert kind of view on the platform.
So I think it's first and foremost important to say that in terms of our policy when it comes to hate speech, we do have misogyny called out there. So if and when we find something like that around that content, we will remove it. But in addition to that, we really strive really hard to make our users feel empowered in their experience. So part of that includes things like making it as easy as possible to report content. We know that we are not always going to get it right away. Like, we might not have seen something. Context really matters in a lot of these things. Like, it's so important for us to recognize that maybe we didn't really understand how it came across. And if you think that's actually a problematic piece of content, please let us know, because then we can actually look into it a little bit more detailed. But we want to also empower you to make sure that your experience is, you know, a positive one as far as possible for yourself. We want you to feel comfortable when you're using our platform. So we, for example, have made it as possible to bulk delete and block content, accounts, you know, things like that, to really help you tailor your experience so that it's, I know from speaking to creators that it can be quite a negative experience for some of them, especially those who, you know, for example, from the LGBTQ community, and they said that things like that, or allowing to filter some of the content so they don't see some of these comments, like, you know, very specific slurs towards them, or very, very personal to them kind of content, like they would be able to filter that out. So again, like really helping them tailor and customize their experience to be a positive one. But yeah, no, these are just definitely things that we think about all the time. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, and I will be very brief because I know that we're waiting for the networking reception now. I think that comment about misogyny is really important, and I think we can't shy away from talking about these things, which are actually quite difficult for a lot of teachers to talk about. I think that there was some really sort of difficult guidance given to schools, you know, where, for instance, Andrew Tate, you know, we all know who we're talking about, and a lot of schools were told, don't talk about Andrew Tate, but actually that is exactly what he wanted schools to be saying, you know, for the argument to be shut down, oh, I'm not allowed to have an opinion, I'm not allowed to ask questions. I get that when we've had sort of, you know, the Blue Whale Challenge, Momo, those things, we don't name those, you know, we don't kind of talk in more general terms, but I think sometimes we just need to actually grasp the nettle and have these conversations, difficult though they may be, and I think that's where it's hard for, you know, it's hard for me as somebody who, this is all I do, but when you're a teacher who's trying to plan lessons around your curriculum and all this sort of stuff, and then somebody says, tackle online misogyny, or I'll do cyberbullying because I'm kind of comfortable with that. So we've got to push ourselves a little bit and, you know, tackle the hard things as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we have a big round of applause? Dr. Nikki Su, Dr. Amy Orban, and Carl Hopwood, thank you very much. This was the third panel of the day, and the final panel about youth digital well-being. Thank you so much, everybody. First of all, everybody who lasted online, thank you very much that you're still with us. You're the reason we are doing this, and you're the reason we are doing this. My name is Boris Radanovic, as I said in the beginning, and it was a pleasure spending the day with you. This is our fourth Online Safety Day. We're going to be continuing doing it. But if I can just, before I pass on to Ben and the closing, or on this side, I do apologize, just to say a couple of things. As you heard here, we all need to better understand this, and we cannot be doing that without your support. SWGfL, TikTok, many of the other organizations that you heard here today all have social media. We all have newsletters. We all have outreach activities. We need to get to you so you can spread our messages. So please do follow us, whether that's on social media of your choice or maybe on TikTok. Please follow us there as well. But just to end with something rather important for us, we have been doing this for 23 years. We will not give up, but we cannot do it without you. So your fully support and you being here today and you watching us for the last couple of hours really means a lot. And I just need to say quick thanks to my wonderful team of Andy, Bev, Naomi, Izzy, and Christine back home, but as well to Ben and team at TikTok that made this all possible. Before I transfer to them, thank you so much to all of you being here.
Thanks, everybody. As you can see, I'm not Ben. My name is Chloe Setter. I joined TikTok in April of this year, and I'm the Child Safety Public Policy Lead across Europe. It's been a real pleasure to have you all with us in SWGfL Learning and you as guests here at our offices in TikTok. I'm glad they turned down the Christmas music earlier. I'm still playing Whamageddon and haven't heard Last Christmas yet, so hopefully none of you did either. As you can imagine, working across child safety, as myself and the colleagues you've heard from today do, it's a challenging role, it's a busy role for us, but it's one that comes with great privilege. It brings us to events such as this, where you really feel that power of a movement of people who care deeply about children and about child rights. And we all have that common interest, protecting children online. And we've heard about some significant real-world issues, because they're real-world because they affect children in the real world, even if they are exacerbated online. And we must not tolerate those, and we must keep having these conversations and learning from each other about how best to respond effectively. And one of the best things about an event like this is the opportunity to learn from each other. We have a saying here at TikTok, which is there is no finish line when it comes to safety. So we're always seeking to gain insights from our external partners, SWGfL Learning, many others of you who are watching online and in the room. When we're better informed about risks and challenges, we're all better equipped to respond to them, not in a way that just protects children, but actually empowers them to help them understand this world that we're living in, which changes day by day. Millions of people use TikTok to create, to share, to discover, to connect online, and we're really committed to maintaining a safe and inclusive environment for our growing community. We have more than 40,000 safety professionals working to keep our platform safe, and we believe that people should be able to come to TikTok and express themselves in a safe, creative way and be entertained in a safe and inclusive way. Otherwise, they won't want to be on the platform. It's in our interests as well. So on behalf of TikTok, I'd like to say a sincere thank you to you all, particularly those of you who've shared insights, whether it's questions from the audience online or in the room, our panelists, and any of you all of you just for being here today. We really value those sort of meaningful partnerships that we have with NGOs, academics, and stakeholder organizations. Before joining TikTok, I worked for a number of children's charities myself, and I really understand that collaborative working across our ecosystem is so critical to our shared response. As I said, we have a learning mentality here, working with our partners to understand those trends, to employ subject matter issues within our company. We have regional advisory councils, which Ben mentioned, and we commission research on these areas all the time. And perhaps most importantly, we are doing our best to keep listening to young people and our younger users. We announced our dedicated youth council a couple of months back, and we'll be releasing more information about that shortly. But we know that's one of the most important things we can do, because they're the ones on it, they're the ones experiencing it, and they have the best ideas about how to design things safely in a way that still works and keeps the platform entertaining. Alongside this, we all know there's another significant event in the public calendar that we're all counting down the days till. And I'm not talking about Christmas, I'm talking about Safer Internet Day, which is less than 2 months from now. So there's another opportunity for us all to work together to highlight the excellent resources that many of you have created that are out there for teachers, parents, and young people too. A huge amount of work will be going into that day, I'm sure, from many of you in the room, and we will also be utilising our network, our reach that we have as a platform to promote safety messages and the many tools and measures that we've developed, whether it's our Guardian's Guide, our Teacher's Toolkit, our family pairing control tools, all of those things that you've heard about from some of my colleagues today. I encourage you to have a look at these, see how young people are using platforms like TikTok to develop their digital literacy. And I guess for those of you who aren't on TikTok, maybe a New Year's resolution to have a little look and explore and see some of the things that we're trying to do. So that just leads me to say, like we've said, there is no finish line. That means we're all in it for the long haul. So we look forward to working with you over the coming months and years and continue to share knowledge and work in partnership. So we hope to welcome you here at TikTok once again in the future. But thank you very much for coming and wishing you all a happy holidays. Thank you.